very much. I would like to hand over to Karen, who will chair this next session of mine. So could we make Karen a co-presenter? Thank you, Jim, for hosting this, chairing this session.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Philipp Maas, one of the co-organizers of the conference. Philipp is Research Associate at the Institute for Indology and Central Asian Studies at the University of Leipzig. And many of you will already be very familiar with his works, from his critical edition of the first Pada of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra to his co-editing of the Yoga and Transformation volume, which you can see very nicely displayed on his bookshelves behind him. Excellent access resource. From the Yoga and Transformation conference in, I think, 2013, which I attended when I was beginning my own MA. And I have to say that it was really Philipp's work and Dominic Vujastic who both inspired my own interest in Patanjali Yoga and Buddhism. So I have them to thank for my subsequent research trajectory. But Philipp has also published extensively on many topics. You'll be familiar with his important article, A Concise Historiography of Classical Yoga Philosophy, and other topics from Sarvastivada Buddhism and Yoga to postures in classical yoga to Al-Biruni's Kitab Patanjali, which was just mentioned. So over to Philipp for his paper, which is titled Benevolence, Compassion, Sympathetic Joy, and Detachment in Patanjali Yoga and Early Buddhism. And if you do, please store up your questions in the chat box or raise your hand after the talk. We can come to you for questions.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this extremely kind introduction. I would first of all like to share my screen here and then go to the beginning of my presentation and enter into full screen mode. There we are. Okay, great. So this presentation is devoted to a topic that continues to puzzle modern scholars of yoga for the last more than 120 years, namely the relationship of Patanjara Yoga to Buddhism. Already in the early phase of Indology and Buddhist studies, terminological and conceptual similarities and clear agreements were noticed, starting with Emile Senar's article Buddhism et Yoga, which appeared in 1900. So there was a whole range of further publications in the earlier phases of Indological studies that I don't want to mention here. But what is important is that over the last 2 decades, a decisively clearer picture on the relationship of Buddhism and Patanjali Yoga emerged through the work of Karen O'Brien, who just introduced me so kindly, 3 major publications in 2017, 2020, and 2021. She's a really prolific author. Then we have Pradeep Gokhal's book on the Buddhist background of the Yoga Sutras from 2020, my own article on the relationship of Patanjali Yoga and Abhidharma Buddhism, Sarvastivada Buddhism, Squarcini's book on the Yoga Sutras, and Dominic Vujastic's publication in the volume that came out of the Yoga and Transformation Conference. These studies have shed a bright new light on yoga, I would say, and more specifically on the yoga system of Patanjali, that is the Yoga Sutra, together with the so-called Yoga Bhashya, which as a single literary composition have the title Patanjala Yoga Shastra. It has now become clear that Patanjali, the author of the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, was deeply influenced by Buddhist thought when he created his authoritative exposition of yoga from a Brahmanical perspective. In order to stress this point, also for those who are not so familiar with the current state of research, I would like to introduce my presentation with the conclusions of Dominic Vujastic's article from 2018 that I just mentioned, entitled Some Problematic Yoga Sutras and Their Buddhist Background. Dominic says, the sutras of the Patanjara Yoga Shastra seem to speak directly across the ages to us, if sometimes mysteriously. But this is a false impression. They are deeply embedded in history and culture of their time. Some of Patanjali's sutras cannot be properly understood without an awareness of the Buddhist background to Indian philosophical thought at the time they were composed. It seems that some of the earliest Sanskrit commentators, including Vachaspati Mishra, misunderstood some of Patanjali's sutras because they had lost an awareness of Buddhist thought. Although the background of Patanjali Yoga is nowadays generally acknowledged in academic scholarship, the scholarly and general understanding of Patanjali's system of yoga in itself and its relationship to earlier and contemporary sources of thought is far from perfect. Many philosophical and philological problems are unsolved, and sometimes even the logical structure of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra as a single literary composition eludes the understanding of modern scholars. To improve the situation, my presentation focuses on Yoga Sutra 133 in the context of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra and in the wider context of early Buddhist and Sankhya yoga literature. Yoga Sutra 133 reads as follows. The mental capacity of a yogi becomes clear from the cultivation of benevolence, compassion, sympathetic joy, and detachment towards happiness, suffering, merit, and demerit. As a second starting point for my analysis of this sutra and its religious and philosophical background, I take Edwin Bryant's interpretation of this sutra, which appears in his monograph from 2009 with the title The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a new edition, translation, and commentary, which is a very popular book and seen as one of the best expositions also from a scholarly perspective of the Yoga Sutra. Bryant closes his brief summary of selected commentaries on this passage by saying, this sutra prescribes a kind of mindfulness or mental cultivation of the mat, so to speak, that is in day-to-day affairs outside of the context of Chitta Vritti Nirodha type meditation. Cultivating the higher qualities of sattva is a continuous and constant requirement of the yogic path and spills over into all our aspects of life's affairs and social interaction. It speaks to the fact that yoga needs to be perceived as a world-renouncing tradition, need not to be perceived as a world-renouncing tradition, but is perfectly compatible with engaged and benevolent social action in the world. According to Bryant, Yoga Sutra 133 is not well integrated into the system of yoga that Patanjali teaches. It is unrelated to meditation as a means to gain special insights into the ontological difference between mind, matter, and consciousness. Rather, the sutra, according to Bryant, contains a general advice for yogis of how to interact socially in their everyday life. Bryant takes this to indicate that the yoga taught in the Yoga Sutras is, and I quote, perfectly compatible with engaged and benevolent social action in the world. I suggest that this analysis is an anachronism, an error or a distortion based on an understanding of the sutra out of its pre-modern historical, philosophical, and religious context. If we look at Yoga Sutra 133 in the wider frame of the first chapter of the Patanjara Yoga Shastra, that is the Samadhi Pada, we find little evidence to support Bryant's conclusion. As is commonly known, the Samadhi Pada provides the foundation of yogic meditation, leading to spiritual liberation from the cycle of rebirth through a special insight into the ontological difference between the realm of matter, prakriti or pradhana, on the one side, and pure consciousness, purusha, which is the subject of all experiences, on the other. Social activism neither plays a role in the Samadhi Pada, nor does the topic occur elsewhere in the Patanjara Yoga Shastra. Moreover, a closer look at the structure of the first chapter of the Patanjara Yoga Shastra reveals that, in contradistinction to Bryant's claim, Yoga Sutra 133 is closely related to a meditation leading to spiritual liberation. This meditation, which is called attainment, samapatti, is extensively described in Patanjali Yoga Shastra 141 to 151. As Gerhard Oberhammer has convincingly explained in his monograph Strukturen yogischer Meditation, the Samadhi meditation is based initially on a material object of meditation as a product of primal matter or prakriti, and in the course of the sequence of intensive and extended meditative practices, the material object, which the yogi accesses through introspection, is meditatively resolved in primal matter. The object of meditation in this way ceases to be an object of meditative perception at all. Accordingly, the object or consciousness content of the meditation vanishes, or to put it differently, the mental activity, chitta vritti, of the meditating yogi ceases. Being virtually objectless, the Samadhi meditation first turns into a perception of the ontological difference of matter and the subject, before it finally develops into an unrestricted self-perception of the subject. This perception amounts to spiritual liberation or autonomy, kaivalya, which is the aim of yoga formulated in Yoga Sutra 1.2 as yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of mental activity. To perform the Samadhi meditation successfully, the yogi needs to prepare his mental organ, chitta, or mind in such a way that it becomes stable, which means that the mind must be capable of focusing for a long period of time on a single object of meditation without being distracted. The 8 passages, Patanjara Yoga Shastra 133 to 140, which immediately precede the exposition of the Samadhi meditation, deal with the necessary preparation and sketch 7 alternative methods by which mental stability is gained. Patanjali describes the first of the 7 mental preparations for the Samadhi meditation in Patanjara Yoga Shastra 133, the passage that contains the sutra under discussion in this presentation. The whole passage reads as follows. Therefore, the mental organ chitta is a single entity with many objects and durable, of which the authoritative exposition, Shastra, teaches a preparation. The mental capacity of a yogi becomes clear from the cultivation of benevolence, compassion, sympathetic joy, and detachment towards happiness, suffering, merit, and demerit. The yogi should cultivate benevolence towards all living beings who have obtained experiences of happiness, compassion towards those who are suffering, sympathetic joy towards those who are essentially meritorious, detachment towards those whose conduct is demeritorious. A yogi who thus cultivates his mind obtains a wide instance of karma, and dharma is the term that is used here, and I come back to this later on. From this, his mind becomes clear. Clear and one-pointed, it attains the state of stability. The just quoted passage indicates that Patanjali does not mention the development of any form of social interaction. He rather speaks about the development of attitudes towards all living beings, which implies all beings in the whole cosmos, that is, humans, animals, and the inhabitants of heavens and hells. Since most of the beings of the cosmos are out of reach for the yogi, Patanjali cannot have in mind the performance of concrete actions, not to speak of social activism. This cultivation is of central importance for the development of the mental organ or mind to increase its capacity for yogic meditation. The cultivation of the ethically good attitudes in meditation is considered a meritorious act leading to the storage of white or good karma in the yogi's mental capacity. As a result, the yogi accumulates and stores an abundance of white karma, which changes the character of the mental organ towards an increasing degree of clarity. The just quoted passage deserves a fuller analysis than the one I can present here due to a lack of time. However, at least a few observations are required. Patanjali introduces Yoga Sutra 133 by mentioning that the preparation of the mental organ is taught in an authoritative exposition or treatise, Shastra. which raises the obvious question of which literary composition Patanjali may have had in mind. Albrecht Wetzler, who studied many usages of the word Shastra in the Patanjara Yoga Shastra in an article from 1987, has shown that the meaning of the word Shastra in Patanjara Yoga is by no means limited to the Patanjara Yoga Shastra itself. Patanjali's usage encompasses the meaning of authoritative expositions in general, and more specifically, Shastras dealing with spiritual liberation, namely the Moksha Shastras, as an inclusive literary genre, which comprises not only the works of Sankhya Yoga, but also literature of Buddhist Yogacara origin. The second philological problem in the just quoted passage that I can only mention in passing is the usage of the term white dharma, shuklo dharma, with the meaning white karma, which has a parallel in a quotation from the Samadhi Pada Vibhasha Shastra and other works, as Vasubandhu's Abhidhamma Kosha Bhashya 460. The notion that karma can be categorized in 4 classes, that is in white, black and white, and neither black nor white karma, occurs not only in the Abhidhamma Kosha Bhashya and works of Sarvastivada origin, but already in the Pali Canon, as for example in the Kukuravatika Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. There we read, the Venerable Buddha said this: there are 4 kinds of karma, O Puna, that I have proclaimed after understanding them myself and seeing them with my own eyes. Which are the 4? There is, O Puna, black karma with a black maturation. There is, O Puna, white karma with a white maturation. There is, O Puna, black and white karma with a black and white maturation. And there is, O Puna, karma that is neither black nor white with a neither black nor white maturation, which brings about the destruction of karma. Patanjali refers to related teachings in Patanjara Yoga Shastra 213 and 410, where he presents a virtually identical classification of karma as white, that is good, black, that is bad, white and black, that is mixed, or being neither white nor black, that is retributionally ineffective karma. The last category of karma is exclusively produced by yogis in their final existence. Also, in this respect, the yoga teaching agrees with the Buddhist parallels, where the 4th category of karma belongs exclusively to the Buddhist saints or arhats. How is the passage Patanjara Yoga Shastra 133 related to the wider context of the chapter in which it occurs? As we have already seen, the end of the passage teaches that the mental organ of the yogi becomes clear, one-pointed, that is concentrated and stable. By mentioning stability and concentration, Patanjali refers to the capacity of the mental organ to clearly focus on its object of meditation for an extended period of time. Patanjali alludes to this condition of the mental organ in Yoga Sutra 141, where he describes the nature of the Samadhi meditation as requiring a mental capacity that resembles a precious jewel. Abhijata mani is the term that he uses. In his commentary, he paraphrases this expression, precious jewel, with rock crystal, spatika, and thus uses the image of an entity with exactly the 2 properties that the meditation of benevolence and so on bring about, namely clearness and solidness. Edward Bryan's conclusion that Yoga Sutra 133 describes a practice outside any theory of meditation leading to a cessation of mental activity is thus difficult to maintain. How then is it explicable that Patanjara Yoga Shastra 133 refers to conceptions of possible social relevance, or not only possible, but for most of us, very obvious social relevance, without taking into account the performance of socially relevant activities? Is it not obvious that benevolence and so on must refer to these kind of interactions? For answering these questions, it is necessary to take into account the history of the preparatory meditation of the Patanjara Yoga Shastra outside the system of yoga. More specifically, we need to look at comparable Buddhist meditations that are called the Brahmic states, Brahmavihara, or immeasurables, apramāṇa-s. Here we are in the fortunate position that the state of research on this meditation is excellent due to the monograph by Maitrimurti entitled Wohlwollen, Mitleid, Freude und Gleichmut, eine ideengeschichtliche Untersuchung der 4 Apramāṇa-s in der buddhistischen Ethik und Spiritualität von den Anfängen bis zum frühen Yogacara, published in 1999. Maitrimurti investigated the role and meaning of the Brahmavihara-apramāṇa meditation in Buddhist thought on the basis of pertinent primary sources from the earliest time up to the composition of Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga in the 5th century of the Common Era. Maitrimurti shows in his study that the term Brahmical states of mind, Brahmavihara, and immeasurables, apramāṇa, as well as quasi-synonyms for apramāṇa and its Pali equivalents, are used in different works without any apparent difference in meaning. This meditation is described in formulaic expressions occurring in a wide range of Buddhist literature, as for example in the Pali Canon, in the Chinese Agamas, in the Shravakabhumi, in the Atavinishchaya Sutra, in the Mahavastu, in the Dashabhumika Sutra, and in Prajna Paramita literature. The respective formulas, which differ from each other only in minor details, are largely quite similar to the standard formulation of the Pali Canon. There we read, with a mind accompanied by benevolence, by compassion, by sympathetic joy, and by detachment, he, that is the monk, pervades for a while one direction of the compass. In the same way, he pervades the second one, the third one, and the fourth one, equally, upwards, sidewards, all around, completely. He pervades the whole world for a little while with a wide, far-reaching, immeasurable mind, free from enmity and free from ill will, that is accompanied by benevolence, by compassion, by sympathetic joy, and by detachment. According to this Pali formula and its Sanskrit and Chinese parallels, the Buddhist practitioner seated in meditation pervades all directions with the 4 attitudes of possibly social relevance that are mentioned in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, namely benevolence, compassion, sympathetic joy, and detachment. Quite remarkably, and in contradistinction to what may be expected, the passage does not mention any living being as the object of these attitudes. The text only refers to the directions of the compass and the space surrounding the meditating monk. How can this be explained? Maitrimurti, in agreement with an earlier study on the conception of Maitri by Lambert Schmidhausen, draws attention to the functioning of benevolence in pre-Buddhist and early Buddhist literature. He demonstrates that benevolence occurs frequently as a means to magically establish a friendly relationship towards mighty and potentially harmful beings in order to secure self-protection. This process involves a conception of benevolence as a substance or subtle fluid that the monk emits during meditation, which creates, as it were, an invisible protection shield that deprives all living being within its range of their aggressions. It was apparently this conception of the efficacy of benevolence that the author of the above-quoted formula had in mind when he referred to the directions of the compass instead of living beings as the possible recipients of benevolence and so on. Already in the earlier strata of the Buddhist canon, however, the regions of the universe that the meditating monk pervades with his positive attitudes were identified with the living beings that inhabit these regions. In consequence, the meditation deals with the development of attitudes, which is similar to the parallel passage in the Patanjara Yoga Shastra. Attitudes towards certain beings. Maitrimurti argues, in accordance with Schmidhausen and Tilman Vetter, that the Brahmavihara-apramāṇa meditation played an important role in some currents of early Buddhism, since it constituted one out of 2 principal methods leading to spiritual liberation, nirvana. The first method is based on the analysis of all constituents of existence or aggregates, skandha, as being perishable, anitya, painful, dukkha, and not being the self, anatman, which leads the mind to the discriminating insight, prajna, that no entity whatsoever can truly be regarded as a permanent self. Once the amount of possible candidates qualifying for being identified as the permanent self is reduced to zero, the ego conception ceases to exist, which amounts to spiritual liberation. The second method, and this is the approach of the Brahmavihara meditation, is the opposite one. It does not reduce the ego conception to zero, but it expands the ego up to eternity. In order to achieve this goal, the practitioner develops, cultivates, and expands the emotional attitudes mentioned in the Brahmavihara meditation to an increasing number of beings until the attitude becomes all-encompassing. The expansion finally leads to a kind of burst of the ego into infinity, which, just like the reduction of the ego conception to zero, leads to final liberation and to nirvana. Already at the time of the formation of the early Buddhist canon, the soteriological efficacy of the Brahmavihara meditation became questioned, and its soteriological relevance relegated to a preparatory practice for dhyana meditation, or as a means for attaining a rebirth in one out of several heavenly realms, in which finally liberation could then be obtained. I shall now turn to the apramāṇa meditation in the Buddhist yoga manual from Kizel, based on the work of Dieter Schlingloffs. The comprehensive account of the apramāṇa meditation in the Buddhist yoga manual agrees in many aspects with the Brahmavihara meditation in other early Buddhist sources. It differs, however, from these accounts by containing comprehensive descriptions of meditative visualizations that do not occur elsewhere. The visualizations are apparently designed to illustrate the efficacy of the apramāṇa meditation. I would like to exemplify this feature by means of a quotation from a passage dealing with the visualization connected with benevolence. There we read, when the yogi has turned towards benevolence, the door of his heart opens up. A milk ocean arises in its interior. All the apertures of his body open up. Streams of milk emit from these. All living beings sink into these streams, and following them, they enter into the body of the yogi. In this visualization, the before-mentioned pervasion of the universe with the fluid of benevolence that plays a role in early Buddhist references to Maitri is vividly illustrated by the yogi's emission of milk originating from his heart. All living beings sink into this milk, that is, they become encompassed by the yogi's benevolence. Finally, they all enter into the yogi's body, which may be interpreted as an allusion to the before-mentioned expansion of the yogi's ego as a peculiar way to overcome the limitations of the yogi's ego conception. As I mentioned before, the soteriologically efficacy of the apramāṇa meditation was, according to Maitremurti, originally of fundamental importance in early Buddhism. The Buddhist yoga manual reflects also the soteriological relevance of this meditation. In a visualization at the end of the description of detachment, upeksha, the yogi encounters a woman in white cloth, who is, according to the text, a manifestation of compassion in the shape of the Buddha. The Buddha then recites a stanza on the impermanence of all conditioned entities. The passage continues as follows. After the Venerable Buddha has spoken thus, he enters the city of Nirvana, and not desiring anything at this place, which is hidden by a multitude of clouds that resemble empty space, he becomes extinct like a lamp. And the disciples of the Venerable Buddha, who afterwards enter the town of Nirvana at the time of the absolute Nirvana, become in the same way extinct. The specific role of detachment for the attainment of liberation is here expressed by the word anabhilashi, not desiring anything, which characterizes the Buddha when he reaches extinction or nirvana. The passage continues by describing that the yogi who is about to follow the Buddha and his disciples into the city of Nirvana is denied entrance by the guardians of the city. The guardians promise him, however, admission for a later time. At this moment, the embodiment of compassion appears in the yogi's heart, holds him by his hands, and asks him to consider the suffering of the sentient beings in the world. Being thus reminded, the yogi is overcome by compassion and desists from entering nirvana in order to support the suffering beings. As was already emphasized by Schlinglov, this passage reflects two important streams of Buddhist thought. On the one hand, it refers to the soteriological aim of final liberation, as it is characteristic for the Shravakayana, by addressing the Buddha's entering into final liberation. On the other hand, it also refers to the aim typical of Mahayana thought, by letting the yogi, who at other instances is designated as a bodhisattva, suspend his personal liberation in favor of support of the suffering beings. In returning now to the Patanjara Yoga Shastra, it is possible to identify similarities and differences to the Buddhist parallels that we have just seen. In contrast to the early Buddhist apramāṇa Brahmavihara meditation, the Patanjara Yoga Shastra meditation does not directly aim at spiritual liberation. The yoga meditation also does not aim at securing a rebirth in a heavenly realm, although this may play a role to a certain degree, which remains in the background. As we have seen before, in Patanjali's system of yoga, the meditation is a preparatory practice aiming at the stability of the mind in order to support the focusing of the yogi upon a single object. However, the accumulation of white karma in Patanjali's mentioning may imply the idea of a rebirth in the heavenly region in the case that the yogi might not reach his final goal during his present lifetime. Patanjali's meditation of benevolence and so on differs from the Buddhist Brahmavihara meditation also in its structure. The Buddhist meditation aims at the pervasion of the whole universe with the four different attitudes that the yogi apparently develops consecutively, starting with benevolence and leading to detachment. All-encompassing detachment becomes then the final attitude leading towards liberation. In the Patanjara Yoga Shastra, the situation is different since the four attitudes are not developed with regard to all living beings, one after the other. They are cultivated separately with regard to four different classes of being. Benevolence is exclusively directed to beings experiencing happiness, compassion to suffering beings, sympathetic joy to beings with a meritorious conduct, and detachment to those practicing a morally objectionable life. How are the structural and conceptual differences between the Buddhist Brahmavihara apramāṇa meditation and its parallel in Patanjali Yoga best explained? Do we encounter two historically independent forms of meditation that are derived from a common, possibly pre-Buddhist source? Or is Patanjali's meditation a case of adaptive reuse of the Buddhist meditation? The fact that the early Buddhist sources refer to the Brahmavihara apramāṇa meditation as having been practiced by non-Buddhist ascetics may be taken to support the first alternative. This was in any way the way that Johannes Bronckhorst interpreted accounts of non-Buddhists that practiced the apramāṇa meditation occurring in the Samyutta Nikaya, and in the Chinese translation of the Samyutta Agama and in the Anguttara Nikaya. However, Maitremurti argued that this account does not necessarily have to reflect historical truth. Concerning the question of origin of the Brahmavihara apramāṇa meditation, it is interesting to notice that references to this meditation occur outside of Buddhism, not only in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. Two references occur in the early Indian medical text of the Charaka Samhita, which may be dated to the 1st century of the Common Era. There we read, benevolence and compassion towards the diseased, sympathetic joy to the curable, and detachment toward those who are in a normal condition, or according to the commentary of Chakrapanidata, those who are about to die. This is the fourfold disposition of a physician. Further references occurs in a passage that is a little bit earlier in the text, within a list of desirable characteristics for virtuous humans. There we read, one should consider chastity, knowledge, donation, benevolence, compassion, joy, and detachment to be the highest. The two passages draw upon a list of terms that are similar to the list of attitudes in the Buddhist Brahmavihara Meditation and in Patanjali's yoga system. The use of the word karunyam for karuna in both passages and upekshanam for upeksha in the first one does not make any semantic difference and can easily be explained, at least for the first passage, through metrical constraints. More remarkable, however, is the usage of the quite common Sanskrit words priti and harsha, joy, instead of their synonym mudita, which only occurs in Buddhist literature and in Patanjala yoga. The usage of the two synonyms for mudita in the Charaka Samhita is probably no coincidence. Apparently, Charaka consciously decided to replace the unusual Sanskrit term with a strong Buddhist connotation by two synonyms at two different instances. In any case, the Charaka Samhita reflects the presence of the conceptions that are comparable to the Brahmavihara Meditation outside the Buddhist milieu for a time as early as the 1st century of the Common Era. So that is much earlier than the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. However, in contradistinction to the Buddhist sources and in agreement with the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, the Charaka Samhita reflects a restrictive allocation of 4 attitudes to different classes of beings. Similar to Patanjali's advice to cultivate benevolence for beings experiencing pleasure, compassion for those experiencing pain, sympathetic joy for those of a good conduct, and detachment for those who practice a bad conduct, Charaka prescribes that the physician should develop the 2 attitudes of benevolence and compassion towards the diseased, sympathetic joy to the curable, and detachment or indifference for the healthy, or the ones that are about to die. Unlike the passage from the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, Charaka's attestation of a comparative series of mental attitudes possesses indeed a social dimension, although it does not call for social activism, but prescribes the correct professional attitude of physicians towards their patients. A further scheme containing partly a restrictive allocation of the 4 mental attitudes towards different kinds of being appears in Maswati's Tattvartha Adhigama Sutra 7.6, which reads, benevolence for all beings, joy for those who are of higher quality, compassion for those who are tormented, and detachment for those who cannot be instructed. This advice, which has no parallel in Jaina canonical literature, appears in Umaswati's work as an addition to the teaching of the 5 vows, vrata, that equally have to be kept by Jaina lay followers and monastics. It allocates the 4 attitudes to 4 classes of beings, of which the first class, however, is all-comprehensive, all living beings. Since the sutra is not very strongly integrated into the context of the Tattvartha Adhigama Sutra and appears without a parallel in the canonical literature, Hermann Jacobi may have correctly concluded that Maswati reused the text of Yoga Sutra 133 when he created his own sutra composition. In any case, the Pali attestation of the Brahmavihara apramāṇa formulation are probably several hundred years older than that of the Charaka Samhita, and not to speak of the Tattvartha Adhigama Sutra, which may be dated to the 5th century of the Common Era. And thus the Pali sources remain by far the oldest literary evidence for the practice of this meditation. However, 2 further references to the cultivation of benevolence and so on occur in the Patanjala Yoga Shastra. The first one is found in the 3rd chapter within the context of the acquisition of supernatural powers and knowledge as a result of 3 sequential forms of meditation on a single object, namely fixation, dharana, meditation, dhyana, and absorption, samadhi. Patanjali calls, as is well known, this sequence complete restriction, samyama. When according to Patanjali Yoga Shastra 3.23, the complete restriction is directed towards benevolence, compassion, sympathetic joy, it generates specific powers, bala, namely the slightly obscure power of benevolence, compassion, and sympathetic joy that do not occur elsewhere in Patanjali Yoga. Detachment, however, does not function as an object of complete restriction and therefore does not produce a special power. Regardless of how these special powers are to be interpreted, Patanjali Yoga Shastra 3.23 clearly attests that the practice of benevolence and so on was relevant for Patanjali also outside the context of the preparatory practice of the Samadhi meditation. A further reference to the set of 4 attitudes of benevolence and so on occurs at Patanjali Yoga Shastra 4.10, where Patanjali argues that the existence of the mental organ is without the beginning in time. He justifies his claim through the argument that desire, which is a property of the mental organ, also lacks a beginning. Yoga Sutra 4.10 then provides the occasion for a characterization of the mental organ as being all-pervasive, vibhu. The functioning of the mental organ, however, is not all-pervasive, but subject to expansion and contraction, in accordance with specific causes like the fulfillment of dharma. The most effective cause for an expansion of the functions of the mental organ are those related directly to the mental organ, like, for example, belief, shraddha. In order to support his view, Patanjali provides a quote from a yet unidentified source, which reads, "And so it has been said, these very activities of meditating yogis, benevolence and so on, which are essentially independent of outer means, generate excellent merit, dharma." This passage agrees with the previously discussed text from Patanjali Yoga Shastra 1.33 in that the cultivation of benevolence and so on is said to generate a special kind of karma that is here also called dharma and designated as excellent, prakrishta, whereas in Patanjali Yoga Shastra 1.33 it was called bright, shukla. And I think these two terms can be related to each other and that they refer to the same process. An additional interesting aspect of this passage is the characterization of the set of the 4 attitudes as activities, vihara, of the meditating yogis, dhyāyan, since the Sanskrit word vihara may be taken as an allusion to the designation of this meditation as Brahmavihara in Buddhist sources, even though the meaning of the terms vihara differ in both traditions. In Buddhism, vihara designates a state, whereas in the context of the Patanjali Yoga, it refers to activity, at least according to all commentators. However, most important in the context of this presentation is the very fact that Patanjali introduces this passage in a quotation. He thus clearly indicates that the meditation comparable to, but in many respects different from, the Buddhist Brahmavihara apramāṇa meditation was already practiced before the composition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra in pre-classical Sankhya Yoga, that is before the beginning of the 5th century. Unfortunately, it's impossible to arrive at a more precise date since the source of Patanjali's quotation appears to be lost. It is therefore at the present state of research impossible to determine whether or not the Sankhya Yoga version of the Brahmavihara meditation is an adaptation of a Buddhist model or whether both meditations have developed from a common source that has not survived to the present day. It is, however, quite obvious that the Patanjala conception of benevolence and so on is well integrated into classical yoga from a doctrinal point of view, and that this conception is incompatible with its Buddhist parallels. Taking into consideration the internal coherence of conceptions related to meditations, drawing upon the cultivation of benevolence and so on in Patanjali Yoga, I find it difficult to follow the argumentation of Pradeep Gokal, who in his monograph that I already mentioned from 2020, entitled the Yoga Sutra, a new introduction to the Buddhist roots of the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, argues that Vyasa, the alleged author of the Bhashya part of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, misunderstood the original meaning of Yoga Sutra 133, which in Gokala's view has to be interpreted as originally being in full accordance with the Buddhist teaching. It appears to be much more likely that Patanjali introduced an older and at his time commonly known Sankhya Yoga meditation as a preparation for the more soteriologically efficient Samadhi meditation. The historical relation of this pre-classical meditation to its Buddhist parallel, as I already mentioned, has to remain an open question. It is, however, unquestionable that the meditation on benevolence and so on was seen as being intimately related to yogic meditation and liberation from the cycle of rebirth for many centuries, not only in the narrow circle of ancient yoga practitioners, but also in a wider audience of connoisseurs of Sanskrit poetic literature. In the middle of the 8th century, or maybe even earlier, the poet Madha composed a stanza in his epic poem Shishupala Vada, which has a parallel in the 9th century Hara Vijaya of Ratnakara, that identifies the cultivation of benevolence and so on as a preparatory practice for attaining spiritual liberation through meditation. There we read, Maitriyadi Chitta Parikarma Vido Vidaya Klesha Prahanam Ihalapta Sabija Yoga Pyatim cha sattva purushan yatadi gamya vanchanti tam apisamadhi brito nirodum. And the stanza translates as, and here absorption practicing yogis, knowing that benevolence, etc., prepare the mind, effect the removal of afflictions, klesha, and reach an object-related concentration. They realize the awareness of the difference of mind matter, sattva, and subject purusha, and then they even want to let this cease. There are thus excellent reasons. So what we see here is that this stanza reflects the process that I have described earlier, and that also was elaborated upon by Oberhammer as being a common view even among non-specialists, namely that Maitreya and so on are the preparations of the mind, that then this leads to different levels of meditation, and in the end, all objects of consciousness then have to cease in order to again to obtain spiritual liberation. So I've analyzed this stanza and its context and the use of yogic conceptions in the Shishupala Vada in an article that I published in 2017. Returning to the beginning of my presentation, I would like to stress that there are, of course, excellent reasons for social activism, also for benevolence and other socially beneficial and ethically good forms of actions. But the fact that they are prescribed in the Yoga Sutra is none of them. So I would, of course, encourage everybody and all yoga practitioners to socially engage, to perform benevolent and compassionate activities. But I think it's a mistake to argue that one should do so because these forms of activity, these ethical good activities, are prescribed in Yoga Sutra 133. That's an anachronism, as I argued. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Philipp, for a clear presentation. And I, for one, have many comments and questions, but we will go to the chat first. I wondered if I could perhaps just first make a comment in terms of another text that might be interesting for you to look at, and perhaps you already have. But In one of your last slides where you looked at the Shishupala Pada, I think the Brahmaviharas were presented as a way to remove the kleshas or to eliminate the kleshas. And that, for me, links to a text like the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra, where in many of the early layers of that text, which, as we know, the final redaction is contemporaneous with the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, but some of the early books like the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the Shravaka Bhumi, the Bhavanamaya Bhumi, those early books of the Yogacara Bhumi, they use the Brahmaviharas in a formula to eliminate the kleshas. So you have these 5 kleshas and then 5 counterstates or antidotes, and the Brahmaviharas are always used to remove aversion or hatred, which is dvesha, or malice, vyapada. So that links back to your slide on the early Pali formula that Maitri Murthy was identifying. And I think it's another reason to really accept your argument that the way that the Brahmaviharas are presented is leading to the method of cessation or nirodha, because this is what we find in the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra as well. The Brahmaviharas prepare the practitioner for a state of cessation. But that's just my comment in case it's interesting. Let's go.
Maitri Murthy has analyzed this, the Buddhist materials beyond the Pali canon. He also took Yogacara literature into consideration. And of course, since my time was limited, I could only try to provide a gist of what one can take out of this very comprehensive literary study and very detailed philological investigation into this Buddhist practice. But yes, you're right, there's much more to look at. And in the elaborated version of my paper, I would definitely have the opportunity to elaborate on these aspects. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say it's so exciting to see the Kisel Yoga Manual also being brought into the fold as part of this intertextual analysis. And that's a text that I will also discuss later on today. So if we go to the chat, we have a couple of questions initially from Alexander, but please do add more questions or raise your hand. So Alexander's first question is, why would the Buddhist Shastras be authoritative for Patanjali, given the generally negative Brahmanical attitude to Buddhism?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Again, apparently it is the case. That's the conclusion that at which Wetzler arrives in his analysis of the 9 courses that are mentioned in the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, which is a clear adaptation of earlier Buddhist material. And they are also introduced with the phrase, there are 9 courses taught in the Shastra. And it appears that this refers to Yogacara works. And I think also here we have an indication that here in this specific case that I discussed, it's not clear what Shastra refers to, because we have this earlier quotation from Sankhya Yoga literature, which is unidentified, and so Patanjali could also either refer to Buddhist literature as a Shastra, or to the earlier literature of Sankhya Yoga. So maybe this the category of Shastra comprised all the Moksha Shastra that were available, which would not exclude the fact that on philosophical issues there were, of course, debates and differences, and also mutually exclusive literature. And we have polemics in the Patanjara Yoga Shastra against Yogacara, also against the idea of momentariness of the mind, and the passage Patanjali Yoga Shastra 132 established that the notion of the momentariness of the mind excludes the possibility that the possibility of obtaining spiritual liberation. That from a metaphysical that the metaphysical notion of a continuous mental organ is absolutely required in order to successfully gain spiritual liberation. But maybe, and I think that's, please correct me, Karen, if I'm wrong, out of your work, it also emerges that the religious labels that we are attaching to different works like Buddhist, Brahmanic, and seeing them as mutually, completely exclusive, does not entirely hold good, and may come back also from our modern way of thinking about the relationship of different religious streams. So maybe this usage of Shastra in a inclusivistic manner may be an indication for this state of affairs.
We have about 5 minutes left. So if we go first to Just Raj and then to Jason, who have their hands raised, and if we have time, we'll come back again to the chat box.
Hi, Philip. Thanks. That was amazing. My question is, considering the first chapter or the first part of the Yoga Sutras is so focused on vrittis, do the commentaries specifically say what is implied there, that the objects of that sutra are pranis, or can it be vrittis?
Bart, could you repeat this?
Well, it's a sort of a presumption in that sutra that Maitri and Karuna, etc., are directed towards pranis or living beings of those qualities of why is it presumed that it's pranis instead of being towards vrittis? If you consider that you're in a meditating mind, you're trying to overcome vrittis, and vrittis have been categorized previously in the as klishta and aklishta. Why is it not about cultivating those attitudes towards different types of vrittis in order to come to that prasadanam? My question is that in the commentaries or not, that it's about pranishu? You did mention it there in one of your commentary, in a translation of the commentary, but I couldn't catch which one it was from.
Yes, that was the Patanjara Yoga Shastra. That is the Bhashya part of the Patanjara Yoga Shastra, and it says Sava Prani, Sukha Sambhoga Apana, and so on. So it's clearly, it makes introduces a shift from what the sutra says itself, where only the experience of pleasure and pain and good and bad conduct are mentioned, then to the beings that experience these feelings or are practicing this way of living. And I agree that there is a certain tension, and that is also what Gokali was arguing, that originally no beings actually were implied, or that this restrictive allocation was not intended. There is the question of why Patanjali expressed him at several instances so unclearly in the sutra part, and I would argue that maybe some of the sutras come from an earlier work, that some of these formulations already had become authoritative, that he took them, arranged them in a novel way, and then interpreted them according to what he thought would be the most appropriate way to interpret them in order to create this new system of yoga, that is the Patanjara Yoga Shastra. I think from a technical point of view of your question, namely why is it better to meditate on beings than on the vrittis themselves, I would say that it's psychologically maybe easier to influence your mind by taking into account beings which are normally also the objects of interaction. So even if you do this in meditation, you can influence the functioning of your vrittis easier if you connect that to experience that you normally have. I think it's very difficult to address vrittis in meditation as being vrittis, because that requires some abstraction that may be difficult to maintain during meditation. But that would be a guess from my side in order to answer your question.
Jason?
Thanks, Philip, for your excellent paper and for delving into that complex relationship between Buddhism and Patanjali Yoga. I just wanted to ask a question from a slightly different perspective, that being more the reception history of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. And as you know, I'm looking more at yoga texts that were composed in the 2nd millennium, so a little bit later than the ones you are. And I just wanted to ask you about an idea that I see crop up in some of the compendiums that I'm looking at, such as Shivananda's Yoga Chintamani, where he discusses this sutra on Maitri as a sort of for attaining chitta prasadanam for people who are suffering various obstacles, vignas or antarayas, and therefore cannot achieve samadhi. And it seems to me that that particular sutra is actually closely follows the sutra in Patanjali about the antarayas. And so I'm wondering, is this a later interpretation, or do you see that implication itself within the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, that chitta prasadanam is there for the for overcoming obstacles?
Yes, I think that there is a relationship between chitta prasadana and overcome obstacles, as Karen already mentioned. The removal of kleshas plays a role. I think that this interpretation is, with regards to the contents of what is meant, correct. Clearness of mind is, of course, required. In Patanjali Yoga Shastra 141, as I mentioned, we have this image of a crystal, of a rock crystal that assumes the color of the foundation on which it is placed, which means that there may be disturbances in the mind in order to prevent the permanence of receptibility that the mental organ requires in order to engage into the Samapati meditation. And I think, any kind of obstacles, any kind of coverings that prevent this clearness of the mind have to be removed. And we have 7 different means that may bring this state of the mind about. And the meditation of benevolence and so on is discussed first. So that may have been the means of principal importance, and the other means maybe are less important or less prominent, or were less prominent at the time when the Patanjali Yoga Shastra was composed.
Thank you. So I have permission to go for another couple of moments, because we are in the flow. So if we go to initially to Leo's question in the chat, and then if we have time, we'll come to Katharina. So Leo writes, how can we explain the misinterpretation of 1.33 by Bryant? Do the Yoga Sutras allow an interpretation of so-called social activism?
I try to relate the interpretation that Brian comes up with to what Dominic said at the conclusion of his paper dealing with the Buddhist background of some Yoga Sutras, where Dominic said that we have the idea that the Yoga Sutra could speak to us through time, and that we have access to what Patanjali said without taking into consideration the specific backgrounds that has led to the formulations in the Yoga Sutra, and that this is anachronistic, actually, and that we can learn more about what Patanjali wanted to say and had to say by taking into consideration the historical and cultural background of this author in his time. So I think there are 4 levels of interpretations of ancient texts that are interesting. Now, there is first of all the background from which a text comes. Then number 2, the level of interpretation as being text immanent. So what has the text to say by itself? What is the structure of the text? Then we have the interpretation through time within the pre-modern commentaries. And then later on, we have modern interpretations. Now, they all have their value. All these perspectives are valuable. But I think it's not... what I don't find very useful is to project one's own modern views upon the Yoga Sutra and to use them as a kind of canvas to develop one's own philosophical thought. So I think it's more honest and more intellectually honest to say, okay, I'm a modern philosopher. I'm developing my own philosophical ideas, and I'm slightly inspired by what the Yoga Sutras had to say. And this is a creative process that I'm introducing here, instead of saying, so what the Yoga Sutras originally meant to say is that what I proclaim now. This is why I think that the approach of taking seriously ancient sources, commentaries, and literature, contemporary and earlier literature on yoga is important.
Thank you. We'll take one last question from Katharina, who has her hand raised. And if you have other questions, I know there's at least one more from Alexander, please bring them to this evening's panel discussion, which will pick up strands from the day. Thank you, Katharina.
I want to come back to Jasraj's question and Philipp's answer, which I think is an excellent guess, because I remember having read in Conce's Buddhist meditation that where he explains how the meditation is practiced, that the meditation on metta, for example, is such that you first extend metta or maitri to yourself, then you extend it to a friend, and then you extend it to a neutral person, and then to someone you hate. So this makes the meditation on these terms practically, or on the vrittis, much easier than just telling yourself friendliness, 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 or something of that sort. So I think it was a good idea of Philipp's to see it in this way.
Thank you.
So we'll end the session there. Thank you so much again to Philipp for such an interesting paper.